I sat in the mahogany-paneled law office, my hands folded in my lap, trying not to fidget with the hem of my only good dress. Across from me, my sister Victoria adjusted her designer suit and checked her Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. The contrast between us couldn't have been more stark. She, the successful investment banker from Manhattan, and me, the small-town veterinarian who still drove the same pickup truck I'd had since college. Mr. Patterson, Grandpa's lawyer for over 40 years, cleared his throat and began reading the will. His voice was steady, professional, but I caught the slight tremor that suggested even he was surprised by what he was about to reveal. To my granddaughter Victoria, I leave the entirety of my financial portfolio, including stocks, bonds, and cash assets, totaling approximately $12 million. Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible. $12 million. I'd known Grandpa was comfortable, but I'd never imagined he was wealthy. He'd lived so simply on the farm, wearing the same overalls for decades, driving a truck older than I was. To my granddaughter Emma, Mr. Patterson continued, and I braced myself for whatever small token I was about to receive. I leave Thunder, my prize stallion, along with full ownership of the main farmhouse and all its contents. I blinked in confusion. Thunder was Grandpa's beloved horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion he'd raised from a foal. But the farmhouse? That seemed significant, though I couldn't understand why Victoria would get millions while I got a house that probably needed more repairs than it was worth. Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. A horse and an old house? Emma, I'm sorry. Grandpa must have been more confused than we thought. But Mr. Patterson wasn't finished. There is one additional provision. Emma, your grandfather specifically requested that you personally clean out the farmhouse attic before making any decisions about the property. Something in his tone made me look up sharply, but his expression revealed nothing. Chapter 2. Victoria's reaction. The drive back to Grandpa's farm was tense. Victoria had insisted on following me in her rental BMW, probably to assess what she called the damage of Grandpa's final decisions. I could see her in my rearview mirror, talking animatedly on her phone, no doubt already planning how to invest her inheritance. When we pulled into the familiar gravel driveway, I felt the usual pang of nostalgia mixed with grief. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch looked exactly as it had during my childhood visits, weathered but sturdy, surrounded by rolling pastures where Grandpa's horses had grazed for decades. Thunder was in the nearest paddock, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. At 22, he was getting old for a horse, but he still carried himself with the dignity that had made him Grandpa's pride and joy. When he saw me approaching, he nickered softly and trotted over to the fence. "Hey, beautiful boy," I whispered, stroking his velvet nose. "Looks like we're stuck with each other now." Victoria approached, her heels clicking impractically on the gravel. "Emma, you can't seriously be planning to keep that horse. Do you have any idea how much it costs to maintain an animal like that?" I turned to face her, feeling a familiar surge of irritation. "His name is Thunder, and yes, I'm keeping him. Grandpa wanted me to have him. Grandpa also thought it was a good idea to leave you a house that's probably falling apart while giving me the responsibility of managing $12 million, Victoria said, her voice dripping with condescension. Maybe we should consider that his judgment wasn't entirely sound. I bit back my first response, which would have been uncharitable. Instead, I focused on Thunder's warm breath against my palm. "The will is what it is, Victoria. I'm not asking you for anything." "Good, because I have plans for that money. Real plans that will actually make a difference in the world." I wondered what Victoria's definition of making a difference entailed, but I didn't ask. We'd grown apart over the years, our paths diverging so completely that we barely spoke except at family gatherings. Chapter 3. Settling in. After Victoria left for her hotel in town, I spent the evening walking through the farmhouse alone. Every room held memories. The kitchen where Grandpa taught me to make his famous apple pie. The living room where we'd watch old westerns together. The back porch where he'd tell stories about his father and grandfather who'd built this place. The house was larger than I remembered, with high ceilings and solid hardwood floors that had aged to a rich honey color. Yes, it needed work. The wallpaper was peeling in places and some of the windows stuck, but the bones were good. This was a house built to last, constructed by people who understood craftsmanship. I'd brought an overnight bag, planning to stay for a few days while I figured out what to do next. My veterinary practice back home could manage without me for a week, and I needed time to process everything that had happened. Thunder whinnied from the paddock, and I went out to check on him one more time before dark. He was a magnificent animal, with intelligent eyes and a spirit that had never been broken despite his age. Grandpa had always said Thunder was special, that he had an intuition about people and places that was almost supernatural. "What am I going to do with you, boy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. "I live in a tiny apartment above my clinic. I don't have pasture land or a barn." Thunder nudged my shoulder gently, as if he understood my dilemma and wasn't worried about it. Maybe he knew something I didn't. That night, I slept in my old bedroom, the same one I'd used during childhood visits. The bed was still covered with the quilt Grandma had made before she died, and the walls still held my amateur horse drawings from when I was 10 years old. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the countryside, owls hooting, the distant lowing of cattle from neighboring farms, the whisper of wind through the old oak trees. It was so different from the constant hum of traffic and sirens I'd grown accustomed to in town. Chapter 4. The Attic Discovery. The next morning, I decided to tackle the attic. Mr. Patterson's specific mention of it had been nagging at me, and I figured I might as well start with the most daunting task. The attic access was through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway, and I could tell from the dust on the rungs that no one had been up there in years. The space was larger than I'd expected, running the full length of the house with dormer windows at each end that provided surprisingly good natural light. Decades of accumulated belongings filled the space, old furniture covered in sheets, trunks full of clothes from various eras, boxes of books and papers, and farm equipment that had probably been stored up here when it became obsolete. I started with the boxes nearest the ladder, finding mostly old tax records and farm journals dating back to the 1940s. Grandpa had been meticulous about record keeping, documenting everything from crop yields to veterinary expenses for his horses. As I worked my way deeper into the attic, the items became older and more interesting. I found my great-grandmother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper, and a collection of photographs showing the farm in its early days, when it had been primarily a working cattle ranch. It was while moving a heavy wooden trunk that I noticed something odd about the floorboards underneath. One section seemed slightly raised, as if the boards weren't sitting flush with the joists. I knelt down and ran my hands over the area, feeling for loose nails or warped wood. That's when I found it. A small brass ring, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, set into one of the boards. When I pulled on it, a section of the floor lifted up like a trapdoor, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. My heart was pounding as I peered into the dark space. I could see the outline of something metallic, but I needed a flashlight to get a better look. I climbed back down to the kitchen, grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer, and hurried back up to the attic. Chapter 5. The Hidden Compartment. The beam of the flashlight revealed something that made me gasp out loud. The hidden compartment was filled with small canvas bags, each one tied with string and heavy with contents that clinked metallically when I lifted them. With trembling hands, I untied the first bag and poured its contents into my palm. Gold coins, dozens of them, gleaming in the flashlight beam despite their age. They were old, some dating back to the 1800s, and in remarkable condition. I opened bag after bag, each one containing more coins, some gold, some silver, all of them clearly valuable. But that wasn't all. Beneath the bags of coins, I found a leather portfolio tied with a ribbon. Inside were documents, land deeds, stock certificates, and what appeared to be mining claims from Colorado and California. Some of the papers were so old, they were written in faded ink with a fountain pen. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a small collection of old coins. This was a treasure trove that had been hidden away for decades, possibly generations. At the bottom of the portfolio, I found a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, dated just 6 months before his death. My dear Emma, if you're reading this, then you've found what I've been keeping safe for the right person. This collection belonged to my grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, who was a prospector during the California gold rush. He was also a shrewd businessman who invested his findings wisely. I've added to it over the years, but I never felt right spending what he worked so hard to accumulate. I'm leaving it to you because you have his spirit. You understand the value of hard work and you'll use this gift responsibly. The horse will help you understand. Trust Thunder's instincts. Love, Grandpa. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Thunder would help me understand? What did that mean? I carefully returned everything to the hidden compartment and replaced the floorboard. I needed time to think, to research, to figure out exactly what I'd inherited. Chapter 6. Research and Revelation. I spent the next 2 days researching everything I could find about my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison. What I discovered was fascinating. He'd been one of the thousands who'd rushed to California in 1849, but unlike most prospectors who went bust, he'd been successful. More importantly, he'd been smart about his success. According to the documents I'd found, Samuel had used his gold to buy land and invest in early railroad companies. Some of the stock certificates in the portfolio were for companies that had eventually become major corporations. If they were still valid, they could be worth a fortune. I also researched the coins themselves, using online databases and auction sites to get a sense of their value. What I found made my head spin. Some of the rarer pieces were worth thousands of dollars each, and I had dozens of them. But I kept coming back to Grandpa's cryptic message about thunder helping me understand. What could a horse possibly have to do with a hidden treasure? On the third day, I decided to take Thunder for a ride. I'd found Grandpa's old saddle in the barn, and though Thunder was older now, he was still strong enough for gentle trail rides. We headed out across the pastures, following paths I remembered from childhood. Thunder seemed to know where he was going, picking his way confidently across the rolling hills. We rode for about an hour before he stopped suddenly. His ears pricked forward, his attention focused on something I couldn't see. We were standing at the edge of what had once been a small cemetery, now overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. Most of the headstones were so weathered they were unreadable, but Thunder walked directly to one particular grave and stood there, perfectly still. I dismounted and pushed aside the overgrown grass. The headstone was made of granite, more elaborate than the others, and the inscription was still legible. Samuel Morrison, 1825-1889, beloved husband and father. He found gold in the hills and treasure in his family. This was it. This was where my great-great-grandfather was buried, and somehow Thunder had known to bring me here. Chapter 7. The full picture. Standing at Samuel Morrison's grave, I finally understood what Grandpa had meant. Thunder hadn't just brought me to a random cemetery. He'd brought me to the source of my inheritance, to the man who'd started it all. Somehow, this horse had been trained, or had learned to find this place, to connect the past with the present. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area around the cemetery. It was on a hill overlooking the farm, with a clear view of the house and barns below. I could imagine Samuel choosing this spot not just for its beauty, but for its strategic position where he could watch over everything he'd built. When I returned to the farmhouse, I called the one person I trusted completely, my best friend and fellow veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen. I'd known Sarah since veterinary school, and she was the most level-headed person I knew. "Emma, slow down," Sarah said, when I tried to explain everything at once. "You found what in the attic?" I took a deep breath and started over, telling her about the hidden compartment, the coins, the documents, and Thunder's mysterious behavior. Sarah listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. "Have you had any of this appraised?" she asked when I finished. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to someone I trust first. Sarah, if this is worth what I think it might be worth, you could be looking at millions of dollars," Sarah finished. "Emma, you need to be very careful about this. Don't tell anyone else until you know exactly what you're dealing with." She was right, of course. I needed professional appraisals, legal advice, and a plan for what to do with whatever I'd inherited. But first, I needed to make sure I understood everything that was hidden in that attic. That evening, I went back up to the hidden compartment and carefully cataloged everything I found. In addition to the coins and documents, there were also detailed maps of the original farm property, showing areas that were no longer part of the current boundaries. One map in particular caught my attention. It showed a section of land about a mile from the main house, marked with symbols that looked like mining notations. Chapter 8. Victoria's Suspicions. Victoria called the next morning, her voice sharp with curiosity. "Emma, I drove by the farm yesterday and saw your truck was still there. How long are you planning to stay?" "I'm not sure yet," I said carefully. "There's more to clean out than I expected. It's just an old farmhouse. How much stuff could there possibly be?" I could hear the impatience in her voice, and something else, suspicion. Victoria had always been competitive, and the idea that I might have gotten something valuable while she got only $12 million would drive her crazy. "I'm being thorough," I said. "Grandpa specifically asked me to clean out the attic, so that's what I'm doing." "Well, don't take too long. I have plans for that property." "What kind of plans?" "I've been talking to some developers. That land would be perfect for a subdivision. We could make a fortune." My blood ran cold. "Victoria, Grandpa left the house to me. You can't sell it. I'm not talking about selling it, Emma. I'm talking about partnering with you. You provide the land. I provide the capital for development. We split the profits. I'm not interested in developing this land. Victoria's laugh was sharp. Of course you're not. You never think big picture. But Emma, you can't afford to maintain that property on a veterinarian's salary. You'll end up losing it anyway. After I hung up, I realized Victoria was partially right about one thing. I couldn't afford to maintain the farm long term, not without some source of income. But if the treasure I'd found was worth what I thought it might be, that wouldn't be a problem. I decided it was time to get professional help. I called a coin dealer in the nearest city and made an appointment to have some of the pieces appraised. I selected a small sampling of the coins, choosing ones that represented different time periods and appeared to be in the best condition. The drive to the city gave me time to think about what I really wanted. Did I want to sell everything and live comfortably for the rest of my life? Did I want to use the money to expand my veterinary practice? Or was there something else? Something I hadn't considered yet. Chapter 9. The Appraisal. The coin dealer, Mr. Hoffman, was an elderly man with thick glasses and gentle hands who treated each coin like a precious artifact. He examined my small collection with growing excitement, using magnifying glasses and reference books to verify authenticity and condition. "Where did you acquire these?" he asked, his voice filled with professional curiosity. "They were my great-great-grandfather's," I said, which was technically true. "Well, your great-great-grandfather had excellent taste and remarkable foresight." He held up a particular coin, a $20 gold piece from 1849. "This is from the first year they minted these in California. In this condition, it's worth at least $15,000. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was reeling. $15,000 for one coin, and I had dozens of them. Mr. Hoffman continued his examination, occasionally making notes or consulting reference materials. When he finished, he sat back and looked at me seriously. "Miss Morrison, what you've brought me represents a collection worth approximately $200,000. And you said this is just a small sampling?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I would strongly recommend that you have the entire collection professionally appraised and authenticated. You may also want to consider having some pieces graded by a professional service, which could increase their value significantly." He gave me the names of several reputable appraisal services and auction houses, along with advice about insurance and security. As I drove back to the farm, my mind was spinning with possibilities. $200,000 for a small sampling. If the rest of the collection was proportionally valuable, I could be looking at several $1 million in coins alone, and that didn't even account for the historical documents and stock certificates. When I got back to the farm, Thunder was waiting by the fence, as if he'd been watching for my return. I walked over to him, still processing everything I'd learned. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" I said, stroking his neck. "You knew what Grandpa was leaving me." Thunder nickered softly and nuzzled my shoulder, and I had the strangest feeling that he understood exactly what was happening. Chapter 10. The Stock Certificates. That evening, I decided to research the stock certificates I'd found in the portfolio. Some of them were for companies I'd never heard of, but others were for businesses that had evolved into major corporations over the decades. The most intriguing was a certificate for something called Pacific Railroad Company, dated 1869. After some online research, I discovered that this company had eventually been absorbed into what became the Union Pacific Railroad. If the certificate was still valid, it could represent a significant number of shares in a major corporation. I also found certificates for early telephone companies, mining operations, and what appeared to be oil drilling rights in Texas. Some of the documents were so old, and the companies so obscure, that I couldn't find any information about them online. I realized I needed legal help to determine which of these documents might still have value. The next morning, I called Mr. Patterson, Grandpa's lawyer. "Emma, I was wondering when you'd call," he said when I explained what I'd found. "Your grandfather mentioned that you might discover some additional assets. He knew about this?" "He knew about some of it. Your grandfather was a very private man, but he did consult with me about estate planning. I believe he wanted to make sure you were the right person to inherit certain family treasures." Mr. Patterson agreed to meet with me the following day to review the documents. He also recommended a specialist in historical securities who could help determine which certificates might still have value. That afternoon, I took Thunder for another ride, this time following a different trail that led to the section of land marked on the old map I'd found. The area was heavily wooded now, but I could see evidence of old mining activity. piles of stones that might have been from excavations, and what looked like the remains of a small building. Thunder seemed comfortable in this area, picking his way carefully through the underbrush as if he'd been here before. We came to a clearing where I could see the remnants of what had probably been a mining camp: rusted equipment, rotted wooden structures, and a shaft that had been filled in with stones and dirt. This was where it had all started, where Samuel Morrison had found the gold that became the foundation of the family fortune. Standing there, I felt a connection to my ancestor that I'd never experienced before. Chapter 11. Legal Complications. My meeting with Mr. Patterson revealed both good news and complications. The good news was that several of the stock certificates were indeed still valid and potentially very valuable. The Pacific Railroad certificate alone could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The complications arose from the fact that some of the assets, particularly the mining claims, were tied to land that was no longer part of the farm property. Over the decades, portions of the original homestead had been sold off, and the current owners might have legal claims to any mineral rights. "It's going to require careful research," Mr. Patterson explained. "We need to trace the chain of ownership for each piece of property and determine exactly what rights were transferred with each sale." He also warned me about tax implications. "Emma, if these assets are worth what we think they might be, you're looking at a significant tax burden. We need to structure this carefully to minimize your liability." As we talked, I realized that Victoria's inheritance of $12 million might not be as generous as it had initially seemed. If my hidden treasure was worth several $1,000,000, Grandpa had actually divided his wealth more evenly than anyone had realized. But there was another complication I hadn't anticipated. Mr. Patterson informed me that Victoria had been asking questions about the farm property, specifically about mineral rights and development potential. "She's hired her own lawyer," he said, "someone from her firm in New York. They've been making inquiries about the original property boundaries and whether there might be any assets that weren't properly accounted for in the will." My heart sank. If Victoria discovered what I'd found, she'd undoubtedly argue that it should be part of the estate that needed to be divided between us. The legal battle could drag on for years and cost a fortune in attorney fees. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Keep this quiet until we can establish clear legal ownership of everything you've found. And Emma, be very careful about what you tell your sister." That evening, Victoria called again, her voice deceptively casual. "Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation. Maybe we should have the farmhouse appraised before you make any decisions about keeping it. Why would we need an appraisal? For insurance purposes, of course, and to make sure the estate was properly valued for tax purposes." I could hear the calculation in her voice, and I knew she suspected something. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. Victoria showed up at the farm the next morning with her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Ms. Bradley. They claimed they were there to help me understand my options for the property, but I could see they were really there to investigate. "Emma, we're concerned that you might not fully understand the value of what you've inherited," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false concern. "This property could be worth much more than you realize." Ms. Bradley was more direct. "We'd like to conduct a thorough assessment of the house and its contents to ensure that all assets were properly accounted for in the estate valuation." I felt like a cornered animal, but I tried to stay calm. "The will was very clear about what I inherited. I don't see why we need to reassess anything." "Because," Victoria said, her mask of concern slipping, "I've done some research on our great-great-grandfather. Samuel Morrison was a successful prospector, Emma. There could be valuable items hidden in this house that should be part of the overall estate." So she knew. Somehow Victoria had figured out that there might be hidden treasure, and she was here to claim her share. "I've been through the entire house," I said carefully. "I haven't found anything unusual." Ms. Bradley smiled coldly. "Then you won't mind if we take a look ourselves, just to put everyone's mind at ease." I realized I was out of options. If I refused to let them search, they'd know I was hiding something. If I let them search and they found the hidden compartment, I'd lose half of everything I'd discovered. That's when Thunder saved me. The old stallion had wandered up to the fence near the house, and when he saw strangers on his property, he began acting agitated. He reared up on his hind legs and let out a piercing whinny that could be heard across the entire farm. "What's wrong with that horse?" Ms. Bradley asked, backing away from the fence. "He doesn't like strangers," I said, which was actually true. "He can be dangerous when he's upset." Thunder continued his performance, pawing the ground and snorting loudly. Victoria and her lawyer decided to postpone their search until they could return with proper security measures. After they left, I went to Thunder and stroked his neck gratefully. "Good boy," I whispered. "You bought us some time." But I knew it was only temporary. Victoria would be back, and next time she'd be prepared. Chapter 13. The Resolution. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Sarah and asked her to drive up immediately with her horse trailer. Then I carefully removed everything from the hidden compartment and loaded it into my truck. By dawn, Thunder was loaded in Sarah's trailer, and we were driving toward my hometown. I'd decided to take Grandpa's advice literally. I was trusting Thunder's instincts, and his instincts were telling me to get away from the farm before Victoria returned. Over the following weeks, working with Mr. Patterson and a team of specialists, we had everything properly appraised and authenticated. The final tally was staggering. Between the coins, the stock certificates, and the mineral rights that were still valid, my inheritance was worth over $8 million. But more importantly, I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for. Using part of the money, I bought a small ranch outside town, where Thunder could live comfortably for the rest of his days. I expanded my veterinary practice to include large animals, fulfilling a dream I'd had since childhood. Victoria eventually challenged the will, claiming that the hidden assets should have been disclosed during the estate valuation. But Mr. Patterson had done his homework. Everything I'd found had been legally mine according to the specific terms of Grandpa's will, which had granted me ownership of the main farmhouse and all its contents. The legal battle lasted 2 years, but in the end, Victoria's challenge was dismissed. She kept her $12 million, and I kept mine. We haven't spoken since. Thunder lived for 3 more years on the ranch, and during that time, he helped me understand something important about family legacy. It's not just about money or property. It's about values, wisdom, and the connections that bind generations together. When Thunder passed away peacefully in his sleep, I buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "Thunder, he knew the way home." Sometimes I think about Samuel Morrison, my great-great-grandfather, and how he must have felt when he first found gold in those California hills. But I think the real treasure he left wasn't the coins or the certificates. It was the understanding that true wealth comes from knowing what's really valuable in life. Thank you so much for listening to Emma's incredible story of hidden treasure and family legacy. Sometimes the smallest inheritance turns out to be the greatest gift of all. I'd love to hear from you. Please write in the comments below what part of the world you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories like this one. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share the next incredible journey with you.